Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has come out recently, and while many people are still focused on the game's main story, there are also a ton of side quests and minigames to enjoy. One of the notable minigames is the card game Queen's Blood. It's a minigame that is sure to make you nostalgic for the Triple Triad from Final Fantasy VIII and the Tetramaster from Final Fantasy IX, but at first it can get a little confusing. So, I'm here to try to make it a little bit easier to understand for beginners. Queen's Blood appears in many places throughout Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Sometimes it appears throughout the main story, and sometimes it can appear in side quests. But in order to be really good at the game, you need a deep understanding of its rules. So without further ado, let me show you a game of Queen's Blood played by me. Now, as you might have noticed, that was pretty much a landslide victory. Now, here's why I won the game. As you can tell, there are 3 rows on the Queen's Blood board. Each side shows a score. The player with the higher score on that row is the one that wins the points, whereas the player with the lower score wins no points from that row. This means that if you fail to obtain the higher score on any of the rows, you won't be awarded any points from that row. As you can see here in this game, I won all 3 rows, which means that I kept my points from every single row. On the first row, I obtained 4 points, on the second row it was 7, and on the third row it was 10, for a total of 21 points. My opponent got 3 on the first row, 3 on the second row, and 1 on the last row, but since the opponent did not obtain the highest score on any of the 3 rows, they received 0 points, which means that the match ended with a 21-0, which means I won. But see, it's a lot more than just getting a higher score. You can't just play whatever cards whenever you want to play them. You have to know the rules. First off, you'll notice every single card in Queen's Blood has pieces that look like chess pawns on them. The more of these pieces that are on the card, the more of those pieces you need to see on the board in any certain space before you can place it. The color of those pawns matter too. If they're green, they belong to you, but if they're red, they belong to your opponent. Now let me explain how this works. Take a look at this card, for example. It only has 1 pawn on it, so this means that I can place it on any space in the board that has green pawns, since any space that has pawns will have at least one of them, and if they belong to me, that means it'll be a space that I can safely play this card. But what if it's a card that looks like this? This card has 2 pawns on it. This means that it can only be played on a space where 2 pawns are present. Now here's how to increase the number of pawns in a space on the board. Pay close attention to the patterns that are shown on each card. The blue square represents the place where you place the card, and the yellow squares represents all the places where a pawn will be placed. So for example, if I place this soldier card right here, you can see that the 4 surrounding squares will all get a pawn placed on them. This means that the ones that already have a pawn will now have 2, and the ones that had no pawns will now have 1. It's best to have a lot of cards in your deck that only require 1 or 2 pawns, as if you have a lot of cards that are going to require 3, it's going to be very hard for you to move in some instances. The key to victory in Queen's Blood is to dominate the board as fast as possible. Give your opponent as least chances as you can to outscore you. And in order to do that, you need to be able to play cards fast and effectively. I'm not saying you can't have a few 3-pawn cards in your deck, especially if you have a good strategy about using them. but always remember to keep a lot of 1 and 2 pawn cards in there for ease of movement. There are also some cards that add special effects to the boards. Some of them will add extra score points to a space, and some of them will detract points from a space, which can act as a double-edged sword. You can use those cards to take points away from your opponent, or you could accidentally take points away from yourself. So you want to be mindful of the cards you play, and make sure to read the description on all of them. And that's all. Don't think you're going to win every match of Queen's Blood just by knowing these details. The AI is pretty skilled in this game, but you at least know the rules now, so you stand a fighting chance. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.